Have we done the analysis? Have we had the consultants in? Have we now got the action plan? Have we allocated accountabilities? Have we done our due diligence? Have we done our risk assessments? And you look at all of those things, and they're all in place, but they're still failing. That bias toward action and accountability has just created silos in the organisation. Then the sub-elements of the culture become about blame. Well, I couldn't do my job because legal failed or finance failed or IT failed or whatever it is. And then the IT guys say, well, hang on a minute, you didn't engage us early. All that stuff that we've all heard forever and a day. But the point was that was the ingredient that was missing behind the organisation's ability to solve the problem that it had been trying to solve for some years. You know, in the Jan Carlson word, it's a real moment of truth though, because it gets to that point where the individuals who have carriage of the organisation and custodianship of its strategy and how we're executing, quite often they have to think, maybe the problem is me. Every single individual in an organisation has to get to the point where they're in that valley of despair, and they'll do one of two things. They'll either opt out of the situation or they'll start to embrace the future. And sometimes that future is an organisation without them involved.
Please give me a minute of your time. If analytics are to be believed, you're more likely to be a listener than a subscriber. No, this isn't a plea for your money, but it is a plea for your support, which can be free. The good news is you're already doing the hard part by taking the time to listen to conversations that are consequential. This show is still being built episode by episode, guest by guest, and your subscription and feedback helps me to determine who to invite, what to ask, so we can ensure that we deliver the most consequential content to you possible. So please, take a moment to subscribe on your platform of choice. Thank you for listening. Now, let's get on with the show. Most organisations that embark on transformation do not fail for want of ambition. They fail because the people leading the change are, in important respects, the authors of the conditions they're trying to fix. The thinking that built the current operating model is the same thinking now tasked with dismantling it. The assumptions that produce the strategy are still running quietly in the background, shaping which options get considered and which get dismissed before they reach the table. Nick Hassett has spent his career intervening at precisely that juncture, not as a theorist, but as someone who is called in when the situation is already dynamic, the politics are already difficult, and the gap between what the board believes is happening and what is actually happening has grown wider than anyone has yet said aloud. His work spans banking, technology, essential infrastructure and sport across Australia and Asia, and covers the full arc of an organisation under pressure, mobilisation, intervention and recovery. His proposition is, at its core, an epistemological one. Borrowing from Einstein, he argues that the problem cannot be solved by the same thinking with which it was created. The corollary, and this is where the practical work begins, is that someone has to bring a different structure to bear, not a rigid framework imposed on a fluid situation, but a disciplined way of reading what is actually in front of you. The strategy, the operating model, the capability gaps, the culture, and the distance between where the organisation says it is going, and where its behaviour suggests it will actually land. What distinguishes Nick is that he works at the intersection of the strategic and the political, where boards, executives, and the realities of execution must somehow be kept in alignment long enough for change to take hold. Today's conversation is about what that actually requires of a leader. Nick Hassett, welcome to On the Subject of Leadership.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was a very nice introduction. Appreciate that.
My pleasure. You've had a very dynamic career, so in a sense it was an introduction that wrote itself off the back of your experience.
Well, thank you for that. And, 30-odd years, so I've still got a 3 in front of it, but, it's getting closer to that 4. In what I'll call strategy execution, major projects, they've got bigger, they've got hairier, they've got uglier, but the problems are still the same problems. And I guess you could say whenever people are involved, we tend to just recreate that same problem over and over again. So I've been able to forge a career, not necessarily by design, by evolution more than anything. But I've enjoyed it, and I also think that I've got a little bit of a niche and have something to offer. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Very much. And I really actually love that starting, in a sense, the career has forged as you're going. I mean, I think some roles, and probably I'm being unfair on the legal profession, but I sort of think if you want to be, a Justice of the Supreme Court in Australia, there's a certain route that one needs to go through. I mean, passing your bar exam as a first start is a little bit of a series of stage gates, but I think so many other careers, they are much more dynamic. I mean, I'm sure roles and not just challenges, but opportunities in organizations you're encountering now simply didn't exist 30 years ago. I mean, not to get too far ahead, but obviously AI, technology changes, just such a different world.
Well, the way we execute has obviously evolved, but I think the thing that's constant is people and the grey matter that exists between the ears, or as people often say, PEBCAC, problem exists between chair and keyboard, right? So I ultimately, yes, while I have some technical expertise and I can bring some structure, a lot of what I do is actually just working with people. And in its crudest form, it's helping people think through problems.
And that's what I really love, these timeless elements, that the environment, the technology may be changing, but ultimately the nature of being human, I guess, is as pertinent today as it was back in the time of Aristotle. And I think it sort of brings me to one of the first interesting intersections of your career, given that it's crossed banking, infrastructure, technology, sport, sectors that I think on the face of it would seem quite different. So I'm wondering, is there a common thread that's running through that, or the problems that you've been called in to solve?
All of those environments have degrees of regulation, and with regulation comes expectation. There comes complexity. There becomes obligation that sometimes, I guess you'd say, conflicts or causes contention with more pure customer-driven strategies. Looking at an organization's financial performance and trying to be pure in how to pursue the growth in its financial performance or improvement in financial performance. So the regulation, if you like, or the regulatory framework that sits across banking or sport or essential energy, essential infrastructure, they all differ. But what they do is cause you to think of strategy and strategy execution in a different way. Because yes, you need to meet all your regulatory and your compliance obligations, but increasingly those regulatory and compliance obligations also then start to play a role or influence how you develop your products and your services, how you engage with customers, and even how you manage and monitor your financial performance and the benchmarks and the metrics that you need to be targeting. So, the regulatory sort of frameworks that exist, I guess you'd say, across all of those industries, as well as the fact that they're all planned and run and managed by people. Those are the things that are common. So maybe in a nutshell, it's complexity.
Nice. And I guess one of the things that I often hear when you do talk publicly, or when I sort of read some of your materials, and we'll get to LinkedIn links later on so people can follow you, I hear sort of mobilization, intervention, and recovery often coming up quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I suppose that those processes or functions do a lot of the work in how you describe what you do. I suppose, how do you distinguish between those three models? And is there a particular one where you either feel most effective or most challenged in the work that you do?
I actually find them to be linked. And maybe I can sort of talk a bit more about how I either find work or get engaged. It's generally one of two scenarios, and they are linked. The first scenario is there's an organization, so it might be a board or an executive team sitting around the table and saying, we've got some challenges with our regulatory performance, our financial performance, with our customers and products and services, or with our operating model, whatever it might happen to be. But the thinking won't be solved by the people around the table. We've had a look. We don't necessarily know how to start. So what I actually do is I come in and I bring some structured thinking. What I don't try and do is compete in terms of the subject matter expertise that the people around the table hold, because they are the experts in their business, in their products, their services, all of those sorts of things. What I help them do is crystallize the thinking about how you would plan and then assess the changes that are required to get you from your current state to your target state. Now, a lot of the time, an organization, because I'm an independent and I've been doing that for 35 years, but a lot of the time organizations will bring in, a booz or a BCG or a Big Four, and that's absolutely understandable in order to develop their strategy. So they may or may not choose that organization to continue with them in kicking it off. And if that's the case, I might play a role. I might be asked to play a role in helping frame the organisation's response to those strategic drivers. But sometimes an organisation will sit and then they'll say, hang on a minute, whatever organisation is going to charge us $6 million to implement this. We think we can do it on our own. And generally my response to that was, I'll see you in 2 years. Because what will happen is, the general inertia, the pet projects, all of those sorts of things that have stopped them becoming the organisation they want to be into the past, they will emerge and re-emerge without a different brand of leadership. And I guess you'd say they will end up failing. And then quite often, and probably interestingly more often, that's when I get asked to come in and have a look. Is there something you can do to help us here? Because the board and or the executive team have recognised that whatever path they have chosen hasn't worked, hasn't delivered the level of change that they want. They don't have the cut through, they don't have the vision. They've tried a lot of stuff. There's a lot of noise in the organisation. And a lot of the time, what they've done is they've then moved into what I'd call the lazy option of just headcount reduction. And we could spend an hour just on that and my sort of lessons and case studies around that, and I won't go into that now. But the point is that without a level of structure behind the thinking, what are our objectives? How are we going to measure meeting those objectives? Do we understand our current performance? Do we really understand it, and have we accepted it? And do we have plans that will take us to, in an organised and sequenced way, supported by the organisational capabilities that are absolutely necessary, do we have the plan that will take us from current state performance to target state performance? And a lot of the time, the disciplines, the planning processes, if you like, in organisations don't produce that level of granularity, that level of thinking. I'm a bit crude sometimes, and I sort of say, we have strategy in this organisation by let's try this. And they just start my father used to say, throwing a handful of wheat at the side of a barn. That sort of approach, right?
A very tactful metaphor.
But that's the way that so many organisations, and some of the names of organisations would surprise you, but that's the way that so many organisations believe that they execute on their strategy, and it's inefficient. It doesn't actually help. It certainly doesn't help engage your operational staff, and of course they're the ones who are facing into your customers all day every day. So if that level of confusion exists through your organisation, that's going to permeate through how you engage with your customers and your market. So I guess what I'm saying is ultimately the level of discipline that organisations put into their thinking about their plans is quite often the determinant as to how successful their transformation will be. I had an old boss many years ago who said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Very true, very true. And I want to push into an element that I'm hearing almost as a bit of an undercurrent there, which I probably would best sum it up as humility, in the sense that when you come in as a consultant, you have to have that humility to go, well, I'm not going to come in and try and beat the subject matter experts at their own game. Yeah. I'm going to bring a different way of thinking, a different set of experiences. And, particularly for the organizations that say, look, we'll give it a go ourselves. Let's chuck something up the wall. We're the experts. We know what we're doing. And to some extent, I think there is that slight pressure on some executives and board members to, well, hang on, you got one of the top jobs. You're paid to know. But of course, nobody knows everything. So I think having that both mix of confidence and humility, to have the confidence to go, I don't know, and who do I bring in? I suppose that's one of the essential first elements that's needed, whether they're engaging a smaller consultancy firm or one of the big four. Without that willingness, the I suppose the slide deck will look amazing, but the transformation simply will never manifest.
It's an interesting proposition because not always, but in many engagements that I'm called in or asked, can I assist? There is almost always a starting hypothesis from the board or from the executive team. Here is the set of problems. We've analysed the problems. We know what needs to be fixed. Can you come in and fix these things for me? And generally, look, I'm sure I can help. Let's have a conversation. And I start to have that conversation or a number of conversations with people around the organisation, and then I also try and filter my way through where the decisions and the beliefs of the board or the executive team actually filter through to the organisation and how it impacts it. And when I start to understand what the board and executive team's views of the world are and how they're actually impacting decisions that are made in an operational environment, I then have, I guess you'd say, a body of knowledge to go back and start politely challenging the assumptions that those board or executive teams have. And I think it's at that space, it's at that time you talk about, the need to have a bit of humility. I can't assume that I know everything, but what I can do is use, if you like, my history and experience to respectfully challenge their beliefs. It's a real, in the Jan Carlson word, it's a real moment of truth, though, because it gets to that point where the individuals who have carriage of the organisation and custodianship of its strategy and how we're executing, quite often they have to think, ooh, maybe the problem is me. Or at least I haven't yet solved the problem. And that is common to varying degrees in every engagement that I go through. So I guess you'd say my role there is there's an element of being confronting. It's always polite and it's always respectful. But the other thing that I also want to do is to support people through that process of realization. There's the cycles of change. We talk about that from denial through despair, and then you start to explore, the future, and you get into self-actualization. But the concept there is you've got to take people through the valley of despair. And, another way that I think about the work that I do is every single individual in an organization has to get to the point where they're in that valley of despair, and they'll do one of two things. They'll either opt out of the situation or they'll start to embrace the future. And that, I guess you'd say, is probably at the core of the personal engagement, the coaching, if I can use that word. And a lot of the time the boards and the executive teams don't like to think that they're being coached. But what I'm actually doing is helping them work through and solve a problem. But I certainly think of it in those terms, that I am actually coaching them through a particular situation, and it's only when I get them past resistance, right? When I get them really into that valley of despair I've talked about, that they'll start to get a vision for the future. And sometimes that future is an organisation without them involved. Again, multiple experiences there too. So I won't go into too much of that now.
Well, hopefully I'll attempt to into an discussion later in the show. But I think it does raise, because we do, as often is floated in the press, live in what we term the scientific age. But I think there's also a lot of scientism, which is the sense that people without necessarily a scientific background become very, well, look, I'll talk about the data, I'll talk about diagnosis all the time. Yet what you, I think, seem to be suggesting is that for major strategy resets, yes, diagnosis is important, understanding the landscape the business is operating in, but it seems the relational elements are as important, if not perhaps more important, to at the very least get the process underway, because without that relational piece happening, you can do all the diagnosis in the world and you're not going to experience change.
I've had a recent example, I won't go into too much detail, but where an organisation's been struggling with a particular set of persistent problems for some years. And the organisation has always tended to take what I'd call a very technical approach to solving the problem. Have we done the analysis? Have we had the consultants in? Have we now got the action plan? Have we allocated accountabilities? Have we done our due diligence? Have we done our risk assessments? And you look at all of those things and they're all in place, but they're still failing. So I say, why? And the issue here, and I'll be a bit cautious, but the issue here has been that there's a particular culture in the organisation that has an action to bias and it has an accountability culture. We hold our people accountable. That's wonderful. But what happens as you cascade that down through the organisation is, from the MD to an exec, and then from an exec to their general management team and through, they become self-reliant. Because their primary driver is to submit and please their superior in the organisation. So what they then start to do by definition almost is to isolate their problem into the things they can control. Effectively what I'm saying is that bias toward action and accountability has just created silos in the organisation. And the first victim of silos in any organisation is cross-functional collaboration. So the one ingredient that is missing in this particular problem environment is there's an absolute lack of cross-functional collaboration. And there are very few organizations where, business units, those responsible for the definition and the sale of products and services, where, they must rely on IT, or they must rely on legal or finance or compliance or whoever it happens to be in order for them to make sure that their offerings are robust and they can deliver all those sort of things a normal organization would do. But when we get into that silo-based thinking, collaboration becomes a casualty. Then the sub-elements of the culture become about blame. I couldn't do my job because legal failed or finance failed or IT failed or whatever it is. And then the IT guys say, well, hang on a minute, you didn't engage us early. All that stuff that we've all heard forever and a day.
Yep, again and again and again.
But the point was that was the ingredient that was missing behind the organization's ability to solve the problem that it had been trying to solve for some years, and had done all of the technical work very well.
And arguably, without that cross-functional work, you can't have true accountability, because the nature of accountability, and I always think of the three layers. Responsibility is the thing I directly do. Ownership is, in a sense, extending responsibility to that next phase. But then true accountability is the ramifications of what I've done. The customer in 3 weeks' time who's negatively impacted because of what I did here. And I suppose that's where, as it starts to ripple out, it by definition becomes cross-functional, and it also brings in far more informal leadership, or discretionary boundary spanning, as we technically term it in academic circles. And in so many organizations, particularly when they are in crisis, they tend to switch from authoritative to more authoritarian. They like to impose that control, but that then just increases the siloing and increases the butt covering, let's use the technical term.
Yep.
And I can really see how that would all just unravel.
But the other thing is, and again, sometimes I have I'll call it the luxury of getting out of the weeds, and then by monitoring and observing, again, something I go back to some days at the ANZ Bank many, many, many years ago, and they used to have this this phrase that was part of the psyche and part of the culture of, from time to time we need to get off the dance floor and get onto the balcony and just observe what's happening. So I have the ability to do that. And in this particular scenario that I was talking about, when that, authoritative sort of bias to action, yes, we hold people accountable, all that, when that came in, the focus had become very much about input measures and not outputs. So they were all, effectively it was a micromanagement culture, because they're all the execs were trying to determine the things that the people in their organization should be doing. And what the whole organization had done is taken its focus off what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve here. And as soon as you start to look at that, then it's about how do you assemble all the capabilities of the organization, all those technical elements and the culture, and bring it together to deliver the outcomes. It was the cultural element that was missing. And
I also want to pick up on that as the consultant coming in, there is a bit of that disinterested third party. In a sense, it's not your baby, as it were, and therefore you can look at it with that slightly, particularly when I think cultures get very blame orientated, you don't feel that sense of blame because you're being brought in to solve it. But I think trying to break that down, trying to I guess help people let those political alignments go, not completely, but enough to be able to engage with the process. Is that a key challenge?
The way I tend to tackle that particular issue, it's very easy for consultants to tell, and to have a view that is completely unaccountable, right? Because 9 times out of 10, the organisation will be able to tell you what the problem statements are. And if all you do is repeat the problem statements, I don't think you've actually helped. So what I try and do is put myself into the situation of, let's say, the MD. Okay, so if I'm the MD, who are my stakeholders? What are their expectations? What are my challenges? What are my capabilities? How do I help that individual put in place the settings, I'll just use that term broadly, the settings that are required to deliver success? And so rather than, I guess you'd say, focus on the tell, I actually try and go a little bit further and go to the primary decision maker, whoever it happens to be, or the primary person accountable for the fix. How am I going to help you? Because if you're not successful, I won't be successful either. So, and their frame of reference won't just be on, which we've talked about a lot, on what the problem statement is, but it'll be around how, though, do I navigate through in my organization at this time with my stakeholders, with my regulators, with my customers and providers, and with my team. Right? How do I deliver a path forward in my context? And they're all always unique. The challenges, the priorities are always unique. So as much as possible, yes, while I bring some sort of structure and it's repeatable and there's a bit of a discipline to the thinking, but the answer, the development, the sequencing of the plan is always unique to the customer situation and primarily biased towards the success of the primary stakeholder. So in a sense, there's a political element to that, I should say, because, I never let perfect become the enemy of good, right? What I don't do is to badger on, if I can use that sort of language, about the perfect solution. It's generally much more pragmatic. It's about what it is that we need to do in this organisation at this time, given the settings and the environment we find ourselves in. And I guess you'd say it's that level of pragmatism that comes into play, and probably the thing that is underestimated by many is the organisation's ability to absorb change. So the rate of change that we can absorb without breaking the organisation. Now, I've also had a couple of situations where we've actually needed to, more or less, break the organisation in order to get the settings right so that we can start a rebuild. But again, I could probably talk for an hour on that. But the point being, and in the majority of cases, what we're doing is helping people think through all of the opportunities and constraints and make a pragmatic path to deliver them towards something that looks like success.
And in terms of finding that, I guess I'll use the overused term alignment, which we always like to bang on about in organizations. But I'm guessing finding that alignment is also one of the key challenges, because particularly in times of crisis, it's it's great tendency to revert to the levers you know.
Yeah.
If I'm an operations tech guy, then I'm going to want to lean into technology.
Yep.
If I'm accountant, then I'm going to want to lean into the numbers, and often that's where the headcount reduction, or right sizing, as people like to call it these days, the right sizing tends to come in. But I think to take it in more fundamental terms, there is that very different hat that a manager of an organization wears as opposed to a non-executive director of an organization. And so do you find I suppose we'll call it common failure modes, that interface between the board and the executive, where the executive are almost doubling down on their operations management approach to things, but you have a board that is just trying to see the world and the problem differently. Where does that executive board relationship typically break down during transformations?
The single most critical relationship in any organisation is the relationship between the board chairman and the CEO. And the reason is that the board are ultimately accountable. They're accountable for strategy. They're accountable for performance, for regulatory compliance, all of those sorts of things, right? So, and then of course they delegate those plans through to management. So if there's a disconnect in the strategy, in the tolerance or the appetite for risk, or in if there's a disconnect between priorities or the drivers for financial performance or performance on any other scale that you care to mention, that's the first point of failure. So yes, alignment's important, and there's a technical element to this, which is about what is the role that the board plays in the development or approval of strategy. Do they really understand it? Do they understand the implications? So there's this is genuinely supported by management in almost all cases, until you get into sort of really small not-for-profits, and then you'll probably see that the board play a role in developing the strategy because the management are just executing. But my point being there that the time that you spend on understanding not just what's written down but the implications. So, and it's not just the implications in terms of the exec's performance bonus, but it's about, okay, if we go through this strategy with this appetite for risk and these are the constraints and these are our targets, then how are we going to prioritize that through the executive team? How are we going to ensure that the executive team's attention is focused on what the board thinks the priorities are? And this is what I call the first point of contention, or the first point of risk in that process, because a lot of the time the MD has already set some expectations or some goals for the executive team. They're running off and they've got a view on how their organisation or their part of the organisation should deliver. And if you're trying to wash through change into that, how do you manage that? How do you manage that process? That's the first thing. So then, the technical side of the implementation is then about making sure that the translation, if you like, of those board priorities wash through key policies and management systems of an organisation. Because those are the levers, if you like, that then translate into the day-to-day changes for the operational staff in your organisation. And if we've got a disconnect, or if we haven't thought through and planned out what the implications are of those policy changes, those management system changes, have we actually not just added something, but have we taken something away? Don't just give me another 4 priorities now, because now I've got 64, right? Reconfirm to me what the 7 priorities are for the organisation for the next 12 months, right? Because then I'm going to put my focus and my attention onto that. Those are the sort of things that it's really important to wash through the operations of an organisation so that your people feel engaged. Without that, confusion reigns, right? And then, of course, when confusion reigns, what you're projecting to your customers, how you deal with regulators, how you are monitoring and managing the organisation, then starts to give, I guess you'd say, inconsistent results. And so then, of course, you've got all your monitoring, your control, your reporting frameworks, all of those things that the board then see, and they start to see strange results, or things that they weren't expecting to coming out of the, I guess you'd say, out of the control environment. They say, how did this happen? What's going on here? This is not something that we've actually planned for, and it's definitely not part of our strategy. And I guess you'd say it's how that whole cycle hangs together, or where the problems start to arise if you don't actually manage that whole process. And so, sorry, I've probably gone down a real rabbit warren there in terms of alignment, but alignment starts between the board and the chief executive, or the chair and the chief executive, but it actually has a way of washing itself right through an organisation. And I guess you'd say, I'd say if you don't manage that well, if you don't manage that carefully, it doesn't mean that you'll fail, but it means that your risk of having anomalies, points of failure, confusion, gaps, then they obviously start to rise.
And I would agree that was quite the rabbit hole, but it was a delightful one. I mean,
sorry about that.
No, quite the contrary, because it's actually unpacked something that I think I've been unconsciously thinking about, but it's really brought it to the fore for me, which is alignment is often only room deep, in that we'll come into a room, be it a board meeting, an executive forum, a management meeting, and everybody finds alignment in the room. Yet they go away because they didn't really agree, but they don't have the confidence to say it at the time, didn't know how to articulate it in a way that would get traction at the time. So they kind of go off and do their own thing. And I think that then creates one of the most interesting challenges when it comes to measuring and managing businesses, which is I've got my lead and lag indicators, great. But we expect, and coming back to science, if I heat the water, it should eventually boil. if I've got a particular lag indicator and I change X, then I should start to see that represented. And when I don't, it creates a conundrum. And I suppose the question then has to be, did we do the thing we said we were going to do? And is it just not having the expected result? Or actually are people just doing something completely differently? And so we're not seeing the lead or lag indicators move in the correct direction, but we then step in again to change, when in fact the real problem is not we've picked the wrong strategy or we're trying to do the wrong things. It's just people aren't doing what they'd agreed to do.
And that was what I guess what I should have summarised before a bit more eloquently than just banging on about my rabbit hole. But
No, I loved it.
it's the degree to which the organisation spends time on making sure that people understand the implications of our chosen path. You should never underestimate the importance of that time. Yes, we can call it alignment and people can play buzzword bingo and all that wonderful stuff, but it's absolutely critical in getting the whole organisation singing from the same hymn sheet, rowing in the same direction, whatever other metaphor you would choose to bring to the party here. But to me, that investment is critical. It's an investment in time that will pay dividends, but it will also, if you do not spend that investment in time, I can almost guarantee you that I can pick where your points of failure will be.
And I think that I think raises a very interesting question, which is boards are legally required to have oversight of an organization, but as the information that comes through to them is potentially filtered by executives, always well-meaning, underscored, but it's fundamentally not a true representation of the business. That, I guess, creates the most, the greatest risk for a board, which is they can't and often arguably shouldn't sit directly within the business because it starts to confuse lines of communication and control. But also, if you don't talk to some ground level staff, if you don't hear directly from customers and your sole filter is the CEO's report, and you get I won't say a malign CEO, but just a CEO that has the best intentions and thinks, no, we are the experts, we know how to run this business, and the board, it's one of 8 boards they're sitting on, they're just coming in, we'll kind of keep going about it our way. That, I think, really breaks the model.
Well, and it is, and that becomes dangerous for board directors individually, as well as then the board and then the organisation collectively as well. So, a board director, they're, apart from all of their legal obligations, but how they affect their obligations, to me, it's actually through questioning management. So it's knowing enough about the external context, about the market, about your competitors, about their products and services, about their financial performance, their regulatory performance. It's also about having enough of an insight into how your own organisation works to be able to ask and probe management on, I guess you'd say, on the settings that they have and how they are going to deliver the sort of financial performance or however we're managing the executive team, how they're going to deliver the rates of performance that the board needs. So all sounds very logical, but, so often the conversation gets sort of distracted by the issue of the day. I don't know if you remember a movie had Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith in it. I'm just trying to remember. Men in Black. Sorry, that was the one. And Will Smith's just gone up into the space station, right? And there's an intergalactic battlestar about to destroy the Earth, and he's in a panic. And he says, Tommy Lee Jones, there's an intergalactic battlestar about to destroy the Earth. And Tommy just looks at him and says, son, there's always an intergalactic battlestar about to destroy the Earth. My point is that a lot of boards, especially in dynamic environments, sort of roll with the punches. They go from issue to issue to issue. There's always something going on. And that's great. What they've got to do is sort of step back and spend the time to analyse what's going on, get off the dance floor and onto the balcony. What is actually going on here? What is our competitive environment? What is our regulatory environment? What is our own financial performance? And do we still have a fit-for-purpose strategy, operating model, culture, executive team? Have we got the right capabilities in place to deliver rather than just bouncing from issue to issue? And I guess you'd say that's always the challenge of boards, and the challenge for boards, I should say. And, with the onset of AI that's coming through, I know of a couple of areas where we've got boards workshopping how the organisation should use AI, saying actually that is probably the worst thing that a board could do when we're talking about AI. What they need to be doing is worrying about what are the things that they're going to get hit over the back of the head with in 6 to 12 months.
So in agreement with that.
And
So in agreement.
Yes, we can talk about, and I sort of spend time thinking about these things, but yeah, look, there's obviously going to be some changes to the way organisations work, to the way organisations choose to invest discretionary labour, right? And those sort of things are going to be influenced by AI, as well as all the, the sort of policy settings they need to put in place, and what's the right thing to do with the use of AI and what's the wrong thing. All those things are addressed through policy. But what boards are not doing, I don't think, enough at the moment is understanding not just how their organisation's using AI, but how individuals in their organisation are using AI. And I've seen, and I won't reference them because I don't know how established they are, but there are a number of emerging studies that talk about shadow AI, about how people in an organisation, because they're under pressure, the organisation hasn't given them the tools, they're starting to use AI themselves to do their job better, but potentially they're exposing their organisation to risks under privacy legislation, as an example. So where does that end up then, if or when that starts to all get identified and it blows up? And the board was workshopping how we should use AI, yet they didn't actually see this whole emerging risk starting to wash through their organisation, because everyone was distracted on, we've got to respond. The board wants us to use AI. So I guess you'd say, again, got to get off the dance floor and onto the balcony sometimes and just get back to basics. Let's stick to our knitting.
Yeah. No.
Sorry, I've gone down another rabbit hole there.
No, this was brilliant. I mean, I kind of want to bring two of those key threads together. One, amazingly, is Men in Black, and the other one is AI. Because in the film Men in Black, it's got one of my other favorite lines when I think Will Smith's character first finds out about the aliens, and he said, "But you can tell people are smart." And Tommy Lee Jones responds, "No, a person is smart. People are dumb and panicky." And I think I see the same thing in organizations. An individual board member, an individual manager is smart. When you get them as a collective and you call them a board or an executive, suddenly they start behaving in a dumb and panicky way. And I think that that's almost being compounded by AI, where so much of the material that now comes out, and I'm seeing this in board and management reports, it's very, very convincing. But if you know enough about the topic, it's not plausible. And that is, I think, the real delta that's going to come for boards and managers, and is coming for boards and managers, that it was already hard enough to get that signal to noise filter happening. But now that the noise is AI generated, and particularly as the models are getting so good, they are so incredibly convincing. And my main background is history, philosophy, and leadership, and I'll sometimes get the models to kick out something and I'll read it, and I'm just at a glance, at a quick read, wow, this is brilliant. I would happily send that through. Then I press a little bit deeper, and then the problems start to unravel and unpick. And so I think, how the implications for boards on bringing in AI, I think, are tremendous. And to your point about shadow AI, we're definitely seeing that. I worked for a company a while back, and the executive approach was quite simple. We're just going to ban AI in the organization, because they didn't know how to manage it or govern it at a board level. Problem was, staff went, but I've got a free private chat GPT account, or Claude, or let's not name the provider. I'm now going to take my company report and drop it in there because I'm so under the pump, because the business has been right-sized. I've now got a 70-hour job that I've got to manage in 40, because I've got to go and pick up my kid after school, and I can't work to 10 o'clock at night. This will shortcut it for me. And I'm now loading company data in there, and the board is now at risk of PII being put into a publicly discoverable model, because they haven't chosen to effectively govern the use of AI in an organization, because banning felt simpler than implementing, or, to your point, in some cases, there's such a rush to implement that the governance policies are simply not in place for sensitive and appropriate implementation.
Look, it's real head in the sand type of stuff. Just because you choose not to embrace AI, you choose not to have a policy, doesn't mean that you're not going to be subject to the risks associated with its use, or it's not for not using it as well. So, and it's not just the doom and gloom side, in terms of the compliance risks or whatever it is that the confidentiality breaches that you might be subject to through your organization using AI in an unsanctioned way. But you can guarantee that your competitors are. And I guess you'd say the rate of technology change and the rate of adoption, or the rate of improvement, I should say, that is possible through the adoption of some of these technologies. You'll wake up one day and you'll find that you've gone from, second or first in your peer group to fifth. And you'll say, how did that happen? What did we not do? Or what have they done? And, you'll generally find that you're probably asleep at the wheel. You didn't understand, like I was talking about before, you didn't understand the environment. You didn't understand what your own, competitors were doing. You didn't listen to your own staff talking about, because they're probably going to give you the best feedback out of anyone, because they're the ones that are talking to your customers and to your suppliers. So, if we haven't had our eyes open, if we haven't been open to the environment, if we haven't made our own inquiries as board members, then you do leave yourself open and susceptible to those things hitting you over the back of the head.
And I think also that speaks to the willingness to discuss failure rates in, I'll call it a public setting, and by that I don't mean publicly in the press, but I do mean publicly within the closed boardroom or within the confines of a management meeting, because there is that desire to presume a perfect standard from other organizations, presume a success rate from other organizations, and therefore declare, well, this has to be the right thing, this has to be the right approach, therefore we'll plow on. But I think when you look at the failure rates, and I see that particularly when I do have very frank conversations with people about their AI deployment, they're not getting from proof of concept to pilot, or the pilots are never actually scaling properly for their customer base, or they'll start with a small soft launch for 10% of their customers, but 8 months later they still haven't really grown from that. And I think that because that's not discussed enough, particularly the consultants, no offense to consultants, and the salespeople that are going around are so keen to sell the future vision, that it makes the discussion of the short-term problem so much more complicated and complex. And
look, I was having these conversations 10 years ago, but the topic wasn't AI. The topic was digital. Right? And I guess what I'm saying is the technology changes, but the situations and the common things that are people, how they respond to change is remains at the core. 10 years ago, I was talking to a range, a range of organisations, boards and executive teams. We're not ready for digital. Hang on a minute. Do you actually understand what digital means? And so many of them just sort of say, oh yeah, we've upgraded our servers, or we've put data in the cloud. It's rubbish. And I used to describe it in a way, and in my mind, I think it's a relatively simple concept, but it helps people who do not want to invest in understanding technology. It helps them. And I used to talk about what digital will do is expose your process performance to your customers. And you just leave it there and let them think. So whether it's about an application for a product or a service, it's about, okay, I've got an order in, but where are we at in the supply chain and fulfillment and delivery, or what is your current financial performance, or what is my portfolio's financial performance, or whatever it happens to be, depending on the organization that you're in. It's instant. And by not providing transparency and visibility doesn't mean that the market's not. Your competitors are going to be doing it. And that's what we're obviously finding now. And I think it took Australian organisations a long time to really get with the digital thing, right?
Yeah, it is.
There's still a lot of struggling with it. I think we will see the same with AI. We'll see so many organisations that are tackling it in pockets. They won't actually know what problem they're trying to solve. It's just that someone, a board member or an executive has read something in a flight magazine, or has, got the latest sort of email from the AICD, and they've said, we need to do some AI, right? I'm being a bit crude there, but you get my point. 20
Oh, but
years ago it was Six Sigma, but I can go down that path too.
It's so true. When a company like Salesforce runs World Tour, I shudder when executives go away to it and come back. It's like, what are you coming back with?
I've got another rat hole, but I'll be quick with this one.
All good.
A couple of decades ago, the MD of an organisation was literally reading a flight magazine, and there was an ad for Six Sigma being the next way to solve organisational problems. So, and there are all these there's good thinking about how you would structure the adoption of Six Sigma in an organisation through the various belts and the numbers and how they all interact and the roles they play, right? So I won't go into all the detail. But basically, the organisational size lended itself to having 4 black belts, and you could really, get good span. Then with the yellows and the whites and everyone playing their roles through the organisation, you could get really good span of coverage across the operations of the organisation. He said, well, 4 a good 16 would be great. So they went and hired 16 black belts. It wasn't that big an organisation. My point was, it was impetuous, it was a rush, it was a response, it was an emotional response. There was absolutely no thinking, but no one thought that it was their role to get the MD to pause and say, hang on a minute, if you really thought through the implications of this. I went down a bit of a rat hole there, but that sort of dynamic, and that was one particular example with Six Sigma. But like I said, we had those same issues around digital. We will have those same issues with AI. I get on my soapbox about these things because I actually want people to stop and think through the implications. What should we really be doing? It's not like what can we do. It's what should we do. Right?
And I think the historic analogies are so essential. And this isn't special pleading on my part as a historian. It's more because the situation changes, but the problem so often remains the same. It's a leadership problem. It's a structural problem with the organization. Replace digital with AI, replace AI with change and transformation, replace whatever the technical thing that we're trying to do is with another technical thing. And so often it is still those often leadership problems that sit at the base of it. And I think what we do get is that acceleration, though. And it always troubles me when people talk about AI and they say, look, you need to get more ambitious with your goals. Forget your doubling of revenue, triple it, quadruple it, think bigger, think bigger. Yeah, great. And you can, as an organization, achieve that. But there is also that downside. Your losses, your costs, the hit to the firm can also be 10x'd as well because of the speed with which the systems now function. And I think that piece often goes unspoken in the strategy days, and your risk is exponentially climbing, even though you're only talking about the positives of the outcome.
Yeah. I've got another relatively recent example of an organisation that's been struggling with struggling with their operating model for some time. It's resulted in a whole raft of performance issues. They've then had the view that they needed to conduct some cost out, but because they didn't have an understanding of their operating model, they didn't understand the implications of change. So now everyone in the organisation is overworked, burnt out, the usual sort of thing, right? Nobody knows what their role is, what their accountabilities are. And there's a thread of thought based on what I might call the swamp of what that organisation finds itself in at the moment. There's a view that we can solve these problems with AI. And I'm like, ooh, are you sure?
Caution there, my son.
And it's not to say that AI doesn't have a role to play. Absolutely it does. But I think we started this conversation with the problem won't be solved by the same thinking with which it was created. If all of those let's try this type strategies have resulted in an organisation that is largely dysfunctional and has the wrong trajectory in all of its key performance metrics, how is just throwing AI at that organisation going to help it? I don't know that that's necessarily the silver bullet that they might hope.
I'd agree. Over your career, obviously, you've met a huge number of leaders, board level, management level, people that don't even hold positional authority, yet are still leaders by the sheer definition of it makes sense to follow them. I suppose thinking back on that, I guess, approach, if there's a general approach or even an individual's approach to navigating complexity, that's, I think, most shaped how you think about your approach to transformation and strategic design?
John Chambers, chief executive and president of Cisco Systems back in the 90s, 2000s. You know, the organization was obviously leading a lot of change in the industry, but also around the world. And I guess my point being that John Chambers, and what I learnt from John, was the importance of engaging your stakeholders, never assuming, and just keep going. Just keep engaging, keep engaging, keep engaging, keep having those conversations, and not just about what's happening in the world, what's happening in the industry, and what change looks like, but what are the implications of that change. And in my thinking, if you like, about my own approach to working with organizations and solving problems, the level of depth of thinking that I now put into trying to understand the implications of a chosen course of action or a chosen course of inaction is probably the one thing that I've learnt most, and I think helps me with that, I guess you'd say, that niche or that sort of key success factor behind my engagements, is helping organisations think through 3, 4, 5 years down the path of their chosen course of action.
And I particularly love that inaction piece. I think there is that tendency, particularly at more senior levels, to think, if I pause, I'm showing stability. If I pause, I'm showing competence. If I pause, I'm creating confidence. Yet sometimes that pause, particularly when it drags on a month, a quarter, a longer period of time, it is costing the business, and not just money. I mean, money, I always say, is one of the most replaceable things we have. It's costing you the ultimate irreplaceable, which is time. And in some cases, what comes with time, which is market position.
Yeah, correct. I had and it won't surprise you, this was in a regulated monopoly, but I had a conversation with an MD 15 years ago, it would have been roughly. And I was talking through a particular set of commercial arrangements that are in place. And I'd done all my analysis and assessment of what we needed to do, and I said, we have 2 primary courses of action available to us. And he just said, Nick, stop. If we still have options, we haven't waited long enough. Yep.
Wow.
I didn't know how to respond to that in the moment. I was like, wow.
That's quite a...
That was not what I was expecting from the MD of an organisation with assets of many, many billions of dollars. But I guess it's the unintended consequences of regulated monopolies.
Yeah.
Yep.
On that bombshell. On that bombshell, I'll before we go into a lightning round in a minute, I'll just ask one final question, which is there a question about strategy, executional leading change that you think nobody ever asks but should?
The question that I never seem to come across, but it's the first thing I ask. Right? I'm not your typical sort of consultant who looks to get into an organisation and then build tunnel, right? The first question I ask is, what's my exit strategy? And they look at me strangely. You haven't even started yet and you're trying to figure out how to get out. And I say, no, I'm establishing the criteria for my success that you're going to judge me on. And it starts a conversation differently. When I'm engaging with a board or an organisation or an executive team around a particular transformation effort, I say what we need to do, because everyone wants to start, right? Everyone loves starting. Let's try this. Let's get going. And I'd say, hold on a minute. As a steering committee or as a board, let's fast forward 18 months. We've just agreed to close down this program because we've achieved all of our objectives. We've done everything we said we would do. What have we done and how did we measure it? Really simple. And you just see. And everyone goes back to the input measures again. Oh, we've tried this, we've fixed this. Huh? What have we achieved? How do we measure it? So objectives and measures, but really succinct, clear objectives that have measures that you can quantify.
And
if you
language around that impact. Yeah.
And So I guess to answer your question, that is the one question that consistently fails. And what we're going to replace a system. Why? Why I say this, because nothing ever goes to plan. Right? I think it was when we sent people to the moon in 1967, we were on the flight path for 3% of the time, but we had a flight path, right? So we could always make those adjustments, but we're on the flight path 3% of the time. That's what projects are like. If you don't have that flight path, you don't understand what your objectives are, how you're going to measure it. When stuff hits the fan and you're faced with decisions, on what basis do you make those decisions? Because something's easy, or because someone, you've got your CIO saying this is the best path for this system? What does that actually mean? How's it going to impact on our objectives, and how will we measure success? What does it mean to our measures for success? And you find that organizations sort of drift through projects, and the longer the projects go, the more ugly the drift is. And then in the end, the project looks nothing like what the stated premise around why we started this project in the first place. So I guess, we talked a little bit, but when I was starting about either mobilisation or intervention and recovery, a lot of it actually gets down to establishing the vision for the program. What are the objectives? How are we going to measure success? If you don't have that, then everything else potentially is just a whole lot of good effort, but we can't actually explain the rationale to our people.
And that, I think, comes back to, I think it was Eisenhower, who was president of the US, said, obviously he was, I think, commander-in-chief during the Second World War, and he said, plans are worthless, but planning is invaluable. And I think it comes back to that piece. The artifact you produced, the governance document, the, user story at a more granular level of the team, the strategic plan, it as a document is to some extent worthless. It's what process did you go to get to it? Because then when change inevitably happens, when you need to course correct, when the market just suddenly goes sideways, if you haven't gone through the process, then you lack the toolbox to be able to correct. You keep just reverting to plan, but the plan is no longer of value.
The other thing, though, and I think this is what I might call the hidden dynamic, when stuff hits the fan, there's a market correction or there's an external intervention or something like that, the worst message as a staff member or as an employee in an operations function you can have is when your executive team or in your board are tied up in crisis talks. And those crisis talks drag on for days and weeks and potentially months. If you've got the plan, there's an air of calm. Yes, you can reassess the impacts of what you're being confronted with against your plan. What's the impact on our objectives? What are the impact on our measures? What corrective action do we need to take? Or do we in fact actually need to revise our objectives and our measures, right? But at least there is calm. There's rationale. There's something that you can communicate to your people who say, well, actually, shit's hit the fan, excuse my French. But the adults are in charge. They've got it. So I'm comfortable. Things happen in life. Everyone knows that. But how you respond to them, I think that determines the aura that you create. And I think a lot of the time organisations, because they're comprised of people, they don't do that well.
No, I'd agree. As we wrap up, we'll just go into a lightning round with a few quick questions, if I may. So, question one, the one thing an organisation must have in place before a transformation program begins, or you won't take the engagement?
A sponsor or a leader with 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Nice. Love that.
And they use them in that order.
What's one what's one boardroom behaviour you'd eliminate tomorrow if you could?
The noisiest person in the room takes up all the oxygen.
And the question you ask in the first conversation with a new client that tells you almost everything you need to know.
How do I get out? How will I know when I've been successful? It starts a conversation. The answer to that rarely is a quick one. And sometimes those conversations do go on for weeks. Sorry, that's not lightning. But
Yeah.
What is my exit strategy? Because my exit strategy only happens when I've either upset you or you have become successful.
Marvellous. Love that. Nick, as ever, it's been a delight talking to you. Nick Hassett on the subject of leadership. Good night and good luck.
Robert, thank you very much. Really appreciate it, and I wish you well. Talk soon.